You've been intimidating him with your tone, Barbara. That was the sentence. Delivered at 8:06 a.m. on a Tuesday by Diane from HR, whose entire personality was a rotating carousel of mug slogans and microaggressions. We were sitting in conference room B, fluorescent hell, no windows, the smell of stale coffee and old toner clinging to the drywall like a workplace haunting. Tanner, the VP's newly imported son, wet behind the ears and smug as a golden retriever who learned how to type, sat across from me twirling a Pilot G2 pen like it was a fencing sword. His whole face screamed, "I've never failed without a safety net." "I'm sorry, what exactly about my tone is the issue?" I asked, voice even. "I've spent 19 years in corporate compliance. My voice is even. It's a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. It's how you make policy digestible to the idiots who think anti-harassment laws are just vibes." "Well, it's not what you said," Diane continued, flipping through a legal pad like it contained sacred scrolls. "It's how he felt when you said it. He says you made him feel small, that your tone was condescending." Tanner didn't even blink. Just smiled that toothy, over-moisturized grin. "I'm all about collaboration," he said, like someone who just discovered what the word meant on a LinkedIn quote tile. Now I should have said something. I should have stood up, pointed to my name at the bottom of the very handbook they were supposedly enforcing, and said, "This room runs on policies I wrote before you two learned how to forward emails." But I didn't, not yet. I nodded slowly. "I see," I said. "And what would you like me to do about my tone?" Diane lit up like she just unboxed a FabFitFun. "I'd like to enroll you in some tone training. It's a half-day workshop. You'll love it. Let me tell you something. Nothing gets me jazzed for revenge quite like being told to fix my tone by a man whose idea of leadership is opening meetings with 'let's circle back on that synergy.'" I sat there, stone-faced, while my own policies were used like weaponized Pinterest quotes. If you're still listening, do me a quick favor. Tap that subscribe button and hit like. 90% of y'all never subscribe, but it keeps our stories alive, and it lets the team know these battles matter, because they do, especially for the quiet ones. Back to that Tuesday morning. I walked out of the meeting with a single post-it note, tone training Friday, 9 a.m. In the corner, Tanner had doodled a smiley face with devil horns. Cute. That same day, an intern stopped by my desk, fresh out of college, fresh blazer smell. She looked at me and whispered, "Is it true you wrote the handbook?" I looked up, deadpan, all 73 pages and the enforcement memo. Her eyes widened like she'd just met Voldemort and Dumbledore in the same body. "Why aren't you doing anything?" "Because I don't raise my voice. I raise policies. I don't throw fits, I write clauses." And right now, I was watching. Watching as Tanner was gifted my old project portfolio to give him more exposure. Watching as my title was changed from Director of Strategic Compliance to Compliance Operations Liaison, a fancy way of saying go sit in that corner and file things. Watching as Diane called my audits a bit aggressive and asked if I might consider letting Tanner sit in on policy reviews to learn the ropes. The same ropes I braided from scratch with 4 VPs ago. But I nodded, smiled, even thanked them for the coaching opportunity. Because here's what Diane and Tanner didn't know. Yes, I wrote the handbook. Yes, I signed the policy drafts. But the part they forgot, the part no one in that stale-ass conference room had even read, was that the enforcement memo attached to those policies, that wasn't just signed. It was ratified by the board, with my name on the final clause as origin authority, which meant, legally speaking, any interpretation of the handbook, especially relating to director-level disputes, had to route through me, or, if I so chose, an external compliance officer of my appointment. But sure, let's all take a tone class. Let's all hold hands in the dark while the arsonist plays with matches. I went home that night, poured myself a glass of boxed red, and pulled up the enforcement memo from my encrypted drive. Version 2.4, dated 3 years ago, sealed with legal counsel, notarized with a clause no one had touched since. Clause 17. Authority for interpretive enforcement rests with the origin author unless otherwise designated by board consensus. Guess who the board never replaced? Yeah, this wasn't about tone anymore. It was about timing. The email came through at 6:13 a.m. on a Thursday, subject line, organizational realignment for team synergy. No salutation, no preamble. Just 3 sentences buried between 2 overused buzzwords and 1 passive-aggressive smiley face. Effective immediately, my responsibilities were transitioned to Tanner. My role was now Compliance Liaison Internal Ops, which is HR speak for please keep existing but kindly vanish. I stared at the screen while my oatmeal congealed in the bowl beside me. No prior conversation. No performance review, not even a let's circle back coffee. After 19 years of building our internal compliance architecture, of writing the very language this company pretends to live by, I was being shuffled into a glorified filing cabinet with Wi-Fi. Later that morning, Diane called it a fresh start over a Teams call with a pumpkin spice candle lit behind her like we were hosting a séance instead of a gutting. "This'll really free up some of the interpersonal bottlenecks, Barb," she chirped. "Give Tanner space to lead his way." His way, apparently, stapling his initials onto every single one of my audit logs and calling them vibe reports. He started the week by rebranding my old team as Ethical Empowerment Unit and giving them merch, actual embroidered hoodies with a neon green cartoon shield logo. Looked like a failed Kickstarter for Children's Bank. The worst part, they smiled. My team, my people, smiled through it. Because you have to, don't you? You laugh at the new kid's jokes. Clap when he says, let's make compliance cool. You ignore the way he stumbles over the definition of whistleblower in every meeting like it's a foreign word. I didn't fight it. I archived the email. Opened a new folder, Harmony Transition. Then I began collecting every meeting request, every agenda update, every single revision to an internal workflow. I printed to PDF and stored in a locked directory only I knew existed. I started recording timestamps, version numbers, even metadata from SharePoint file histories. If it moved, I tracked it. Not because I had a plan yet, but because if they were going to weaponize policy, I was going to build the receipt armory to drop the entire house. The first major log went into the folder the following week during a collaborative onboarding session. HR hosted a meet and greet for Tanner to build bridges with cross-functional leadership. We played icebreakers, a compliance strategy table. Diane floated over with her insulated mug. It said nevertheless. She HR'd and dropped this little gem. Oh, come on, Barbara. You take the handbook so seriously. It's just guidelines. I paused mid-sip. Just guidelines. The document I poured 6 years of regulatory alignment, legal vetting, and case precedent into, reduced to a Pinterest tip sheet for middle managers. It wasn't just ignorance. It was dismissal. Institutional gaslighting, wrapped in smiles and scented candles. I made a note. Word for word, it's just guidelines, time-stamped, logged, saved. That afternoon, Tanner requested access to legacy compliance folders. I granted read-only, but he didn't even notice. He spent half the Zoom call talking about reimagining the whistleblower pipeline as an empowerment conduit. Said it'd be cool if we could gamify accountability. My jaw actually cracked from clenching. That night, I revisited the enforcement memo again. Clause 14. All personnel policy shifts involving handbook-defined governance must route through formal review if originating from a party with a familial relationship to C-suite leadership. Now guess who Tanner's daddy is? I added that to the receipts. Not just the clause, his org chart line. Highlighted, backed up twice. The walls weren't closing in on me. I was quietly reinforcing them, brick by annotated brick. 2 weeks later, they had me lead a training for the new assistant Tanner had hired, a 23-year-old whose resume was a BuzzFeed quiz in bullet points. She asked if I really knew all this by heart. I said nothing. Just handed her the printed handbook, marked up in 3 colors, with my initials at the bottom of every change. Later, in the kitchen, I overheard her whisper to someone, Barbara's like a ghostwriter for the whole damn company. I smiled into my coffee. That's the thing about ghosts. They know where all the bodies are buried, and they never forget the shovel. The policy memo dropped on a Thursday afternoon like a bad group text from an ex. No subject line. Just a PDF attachment labeled Internal, Updated Conduct Escalation Pathways V3. I opened it while reheating stale coffee, expecting the usual HR fluff about proactive communication and team harmony. What I found instead was a bastardized Frankenstein of my original conduct escalation matrix. Same skeleton, same flowchart design, even the same damn color coding. Only now it had been rerouted. The part that once required compliance review for all director-level warnings, rewritten to flow directly through HR. No compliance signature needed. No legal routing required. Just a friendly, closed-door chat with Diane and whatever scented wax melt she was burning that week. At the bottom in Comic Sans was a footer that read, Adapted for Modern Synergy by the EE Unit. That's ethical empowerment for those just tuning in. Tanner's pet project, the team that used to be mine. I didn't say a word. I downloaded the PDF, saved it with a new naming convention, co-opted template V3 EEU, and dropped it in the receipts folder. Then I pulled up the original draft from 3 years ago, the one that had a legal review tag in the header and an approval chain that ended with my signature and the board's. The side-by-side comparison was grotesque, like watching a child draw a mustache on the Mona Lisa and call it an upgrade. The next morning, the escalation began. I was pulled into a video call with Diane and a new face, an HR business partner named Brent, who looked like he lived inside an REI catalog and said value add like it was punctuation. They had concerns, he said, about my engagement posture, about how my communication tone might be creating barriers to cross-functional inclusion. They dropped the words like confetti, nonspecific, floaty, harmless looking, but I recognized the structure. Someone had planted the seed. It didn't take long to confirm. That afternoon, I received a copy of a preliminary conduct concern. Formal language, formatted to mirror a policy violation report. Allegations of hostile hierarchy. Vague references to undermining collaborative leadership. And at the bottom, in pixelated signature, Tanner Jameson, VP Innovation Strategy. I didn't speak, didn't reply, didn't cry. I walked to the printer, pulled the document from the tray, logged it, scanned it, filed it, then opened the enforcement memo. The real one? Enforcement Memo V2.4, finalized, sealed, authored by B. Keller, approved by Corporate Counsel H. Lanning, board ratification. Yes, last review, 14 months ago, effective clauses. 9A17C, I scrolled past the cover page. Past the compliance infrastructure map. Down to the clause I hadn't touched in 2 years but never forgot, Clause 11. B. In cases where a formal complaint is filed against the policy originator, any related enforcement must be routed through external counsel for impartial review. Internal HR interpretation is suspended pending legal validation. They filed a complaint against the woman who wrote the system, and in doing so, triggered the very clause designed to keep power-hungry interns and their nepotism pass cards from burning the place down. I bookmarked it, highlighted the clause in red, added a note, activated by VP Complaint 3:22 p.m. Thurs. Emotionally, I felt nothing, not rage, not despair. Just a clean click in the brain, a mental key in a lock. They forgot who built the walls, who coded the gates, who wrote the entire rulebook they were now trying to weaponize against me. I didn't need to fight back. I needed to let them keep going. Let them edit policies with their little emojis. Let them reassign roles and hold Cupcake Fridays and preach synergy while the foundation quietly shifts under their feet. Because there's a difference between being sidelined and being underestimated. One is annoying, the other is fatal. And Tanner? He was about to learn which one he'd chosen. The email came at 9:14 a.m. on a Monday, subject line, Leadership Opportunity Shadow Support for New Staff, which was HR's glitter-glued way of saying, train Tanner's assistant like a good little relic. No signature, no opt-out, just an Outlook calendar invite with a Teams link and a smiley face in the meeting title. I didn't respond, just clicked accept, pulled out a fresh notepad, and wrote in bold at the top, Retaliation by Proxy Entry 1. Her name was Kelsey. Fresh out of grad school, sharp enough to slice drywall with her cheekbones, and dressed like someone who got career advice exclusively from TikTok accounts with Sparkles Girlboss Sparkles in the bio. She breezed into the meeting with an iced coffee the size of her ego and said, "So excited to learn from you, Barb. Like I was a friendly neighborhood lunch lady, not the woman who wrote the code of conduct that let her collect a paycheck without being fondled in the break room." But I smiled. Of course I did. I walked her through the architecture of our compliance review board, the case intake flow, and the risk matrix used for conduct evaluations. She nodded like she was actually absorbing it, tapping frantically on a rose gold iPad she didn't know I could see reflected in the glass wall. She was doodling hearts next to TJ Briefcase Fire. Tanner Jameson, our nepotism prince. I'm guessing the briefcase stood for boss vibes, and the fire was either admiration or a shared brain cell spontaneously combusting. Still, I went full Stepford, patient, clear, and robotic. I didn't roll my eyes when she said accountability is such a vibe. I didn't sigh when she asked if Clause 9 was like, legally binding or just HR optional. I even helped her color code her first org chart. That afternoon, Diane forwarded me a gentle reminder on tone, said she'd noticed some tension in today's mentorship session, and encouraged me to model warmth and inclusion. I printed the email, initialed it, filed it under Retaliation Chain Volume Roman 2. Same hour, Tanner updated the internal SharePoint site. He posted a memo titled Policy Refresh, Compliance for a New Era. It was 3 paragraphs of jargon about transparency, throughput, and empowerment nodes. At the bottom, a quote from Sun Tzu and a stock photo of a handshake. Not one word from the actual handbook, not a single citation. I saved the PDF, labeled it unauthorized guidance material because it was. Policy once disseminated without compliant sign-off becomes a liability, especially when it contradicts ratified documentation. That's not theory, that's the law, a law he never bothered to learn. But I wasn't angry, I was curious. How deep would they dig their hole if I just handed them the shovel? 3 days later, Kelsey burst into the break room during my lunch and asked, "So wait, is it true you wrote the actual handbook?" I looked up from my tuna salad. I did. She blinked, then blinked again. Like? The handbook, the real one, with the clauses? With the clauses, I said. She stared at me like I was a piece of historical infrastructure. Oh my God, that's like so crazy. I thought it was some law firm or something. You never talk in meetings. Exactly, I said. She left confused. I left a note in the receipts log, intern confirmation of authorship. Witness present, time-stamped. They were all starting to realize it, in glimpses, in rumors, in whispers by the printer. That Barbara, the quiet compliance ghost, wasn't just some paper-pushing relic. She was the architect. The next day, Brent from HR pinged me, just checking in. "Any concerns about your transition to the support role?" I replied, "No concerns. Process is documented," which was true. Every insult, every passive-aggressive comment, every duty shift and friendly reminder had been documented. And the process they were triggering, well, that was documented too. In a memo no one had read in full, but I wrote it. And clause by clause, they were about to walk straight into it. Smiling the whole way, the envelope was cream-colored. Hand-delivered, left face down on my desk like it was ashamed of itself. At first, I thought it was another HR newsletter, maybe more coupons for team yoga or a reminder to hydrate mindfully. but the seal had weight, a little too formal, a little too confidential. Inside, 6 pages. Subject line, Internal Ethics Review Allegation of Demeaning Communication. Beneath it, the official letterhead. Signed by Diane and that REI mannequin Brent. I read it once, then again, then one more time, slower, just to be sure. They'd escalated it, made it formal. It cited multiple instances of hierarchical aggression, references to belittling tone, and an inability to foster a psychologically safe space for junior staff. All phrases pulled straight from my own damn handbook. They weren't just twisting my words, they were weaponizing them against me. And the beautiful part, I had no idea they'd just activated a clause I'd buried there years ago like a landmine. I took a breath. Let the sting settle in. Yes, it hurt. Not because I feared what they might find, there was nothing to find, but because these people, these toddlers in Banana Republic blazers, had the gall to believe they could bend the system I built. I emailed Diane back within the hour. Thank you for the documentation. For transparency and adherence to handbook protocols, can you please share the enforcement process timeline, particularly in reference to Clause 9? B, she replied, chipper as ever, of course, Barbara. Great idea, looping in legal now. Happy to bring in outside counsel to make it official. Appreciate your professionalism, smiling face with smiling eyes. Clause 9, B, they never read it, they didn't know what it did. But I did. That clause, added after a harassment cover-up 3 regimes ago, one of the few lines in the policy that couldn't be rerouted by HR interpretation. It explicitly stated, any ethics review involving a handbook author must include third-party legal counsel for objectivity. Internal HR-led enforcement is to be paused pending external audit, and now it was triggered, with their blessing. I printed the email thread, highlighted Diane's cheery consent, filed it in my fail-safe activation folder. By 4:45 p.m., legal had reached out to schedule a clarification call. They sounded confused. I wasn't. I offered Thursday at 10. That night, I didn't pace, I didn't cry. I didn't pour a vindictive drink or call an old colleague to vent. I sat down, opened the enforcement memo again, and reread clause 10 through 14. Slowly, savoring every line like it was a prayer I'd written for moments just like this. Clause 10, retaliatory use of conduct policies, invalidates standard review timelines. Clause 11, misinterpretation of policy by non-legal personnel triggers binding clarification protocol. Clause 12, any policy document in use must trace to a signed, ratified version stored within the compliance archive. Clause 13, policy interpretation rests solely with the origin author unless overridden by board vote. Clause 14, family-tied appointments must not oversee conduct enforcement without legal counsel present. Tanner, Diane, Brent, all now under review, and me? I was no longer the subject, I was the source code. They didn't realize they'd just surrendered the game the moment they followed the protocol. Because when you write the rules, you know the angles, you know the trapdoors, you know exactly when to go quiet and exactly when to ask for the official process. They thought they had cornered me, thought this would break me, but they never once asked why the handbook was written the way it was. They just assumed I'd forgotten. I hadn't, I never forgot, and starting Thursday at 10 o'clock a.m., I was going to remind every last one of them, line by annotated line. The funny thing about legal departments? They don't usually read the footnotes until someone bleeds on the paperwork. Thursday morning, 9:58 a.m. I joined the call. External counsel was already on, waiting with the polite, dead-eyed expression of someone paid by the billable hour. Brent tried to open with small talk, asked if I was staying warm in this weather. I ignored him and opened the enforcement memo on my second monitor. Diane joined 2 minutes late, out of breath, like she jogged in from burning a sage stick over her coffee mug. Let's keep this collaborative, she chirped, like this wasn't the organizational equivalent of a loaded gun on the table. They began reading the formal statement aloud. It was theater. Tanner's words, scrubbed through committee, accusing me of intimidation through institutional knowledge. A phrase that sounded like it came from someone who failed upward into power and got spooked by people who knew how filing cabinets worked. I let them talk. Let Brent rattle off next steps. Let Diane explain how they'd already prepared a developmental improvement plan. Let legal float timelines and coaching sessions and measured reentry. And then, before any of them could assign homework, the paralegal spoke. Sorry to interrupt, she said, voice a little tight. I was reviewing the enforcement memo, the version on file, and something doesn't line up. The room fell quiet. She continued. Clause 14 requires external oversight when a director-level employee is accused under an HR-authorized policy. The memo defines director level as anyone with policy ownership or interpretive authority. Brent leaned in. Well, Barbara doesn't own the policy, right? It's an HR doc. No, she said, already clicking. It's not. It's authored by Barbara Keller. Signed and ratified under the compliance framework 3 years ago. I just pulled the digital signature log, last page. She shared her screen. There it was. Final page enforcement memo V2.4 signature. Barbara Keller, Chief Compliance Architect, approval. H. Lanning, Corporate Counsel, Board ratification. 5-0 vote, date, April 17, 3 years prior. And underneath it all, in a quiet little footer line no one had noticed before, interpretive authority remains with B. Keller unless superseded by board action. Brent blinked. Diane blinked. The external counsel leaned forward so fast his webcam wobbled. I said nothing. The paralegal continued more confidently now. That means HR can't finalize disciplinary action against Barbara without procedural violation. You'd need board review or an alternate clause, and I'm not seeing either. Brent opened his mouth, closed it. Diane tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. External counsel cleared his throat. Let's pause here, he said carefully. This needs escalation. If the memo holds, then continuing this process could constitute a breach. I tilted my head just slightly. You'll want to confirm the clause history with Lanning. He helped draft it. He'll remember the intent. I could almost hear Diane's soul exiting her body through her eyebrows. They didn't speak for 10 seconds. That's a long time in corporate Zoom. Legal ended the call 5 minutes later with a vague promise to revisit process options. Brent's face was pink. Diane's candle flickered behind her like it wanted to escape. I logged off, sat still. Listened to the silence in my apartment. That clause? I wrote it after watching a woman, sharp, principled, and quiet like me, get buried by a similar process. HR had handed her a shovel and called it improvement. She resigned quietly. Her replacement was a golf buddy of the CFO. So I wrote Clause 14, buried it between a stack of enforcement logic and flowcharts, made it dull on purpose. Dense, boring, so boring no one would touch it, but binding. And now it sat there in their own records with my name still glowing at the bottom of a scanned signature line. They thought they'd caught me flat-footed. But the trap didn't spring on me, it sprang on them. They didn't know they'd just violated their own handbook. And worse, they'd violated mine. The call happened just after sunrise, not to me, to legal. The HR floor was already lit by 6:42 a.m. Diane's sunrise diffuser working overtime, Brent red-eyed and pacing with a cold brew sweating on his desk like it owed him money. They weren't whispering anymore. They were spiraling. I know this not because I was there, but because the paralegal, Sarah, looped me in later off the record. Said the whole thing felt like watching toddlers realize the stove was on after licking it. Wait, the junior counsel said, scrolling fast through the PDFs they'd clearly never read. She authored this, not just the handbook, Sarah replied, the enforcement memo. The whole disciplinary spine HR's been using. A beat. Then, you didn't read the last page, did you? And that's when panic turned formal. At 7:23 a.m., I received a direct calendar invite, policy clarification meeting mandatory attendance. Sent by legal, not HR, different tone, different stakes. The title was sterile, but the description said everything. Review of procedural chain regarding director-level conduct disputes. Please bring original documentation and relevant memo language for discussion. No coaching plan, no improvement track, no soft language about tone. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about what I built. By 8:10, they'd already pulled 2 versions of the memo from the archive and found 4 policy changes pushed by HR that weren't just misaligned. They were in direct violation of the framework they'd been pretending to understand. Sarah told me Brent kept asking, how did we not know this? Simple, because they thought the handbook was theirs, because they assumed that anyone sitting quietly in the compliance wing must just be a glorified paperclip in a blazer. Because they didn't understand that authorship means ownership, not just of words, but of consequences. I arrived for the meeting 2 minutes early. No smile, no files in hand. Just the memo, printed, tabbed, and annotated in the same red pen I'd used the day it was approved. I set it on the table in front of legal like an offering and waited. Anne walked in last, clearly hoping the lavender oil on her wrists would do the emotional labor she never bothered with herself. She sat stiffly, like the chair had betrayed her too. Brent looked like someone had unplugged him and plugged him back in at half voltage. Tanner wasn't there. Of course he wasn't, because this meeting wasn't about feelings anymore. It was about frameworks. It was about clause stacking, timeline signatures, authorization chains. And suddenly, everyone realized I was the only one in the room who understood how those things even worked. Legal cleared their throat. We've reviewed the memo. There are binding clauses here, specifically 9, B, and 14. The board ratified this document. You were listed as the final interpretive authority. I nodded once. Yes, no apology, no elaboration, just fact. They asked me to walk through the relevant sections, how the process should have worked, what language was ignored, or HR overstepped. I did, calmly, like reading bedtime stories from a book I wrote in another life. Every clause I read turned HR's faces a deeper shade of institutional regret. When I finished, Diane tried to salvage it. We were under the impression that the current policies had evolved from the original. They haven't, I said. The memo was never superseded. No board vote. No new ratification. You've been working off an edited template, not a governing document. Brent looked like he wanted to cry into his dockers. Legal paused, nodded. This changes everything, one of them muttered. No one disagreed, because now they all knew. I wasn't just the one accused. I was the one who wrote the rules. And every misstep they'd taken trying to discipline me had only sunk them deeper into noncompliance. They didn't just mishandle the process. They'd broken it, on paper, on record. and in a meeting that, starting now, would require its own compliance review. I gathered my papers, didn't gloat, didn't smile, because this wasn't the win. This was just the reveal. The real checkmate came next. They reserved the big conference room, the one with the faux mahogany table and the flickering overhead lights that made everyone look like they were testifying to Congress. Legal showed up first, four deep, sleeves rolled, brows tight. You could tell they'd spent the weekend combing through every version of the memo like it was radioactive. HR followed, quieter this time. No Starbucks cups, no floral clipboards, just Diane, Brent, and that pained look people get when they realize they've been using a toaster as a bathtub. And then came the external compliance officer. Neutral suit, no logo. The kind of presence that says, I'm not here to help you. I'm here to document how you drown. I walked in last. No laptop, no slides, just one folder. Inside, the original enforcement memo, highlighted, annotated, and hole-punched so aggressively it looked like it had survived a war zone. No one said hello. Legal opened. This is a policy clarification meeting. We're here to verify the integrity of internal conduct procedures as they pertain to Ms. Keller's memo and subsequent implementation. I nodded, slid the memo to the center of the table. This is version 2.4 of the enforcement memo, I said. Ratified by the board, sealed by council, and distributed under Internal Directive 19C. Diane shifted in her seat. We were operating under the understanding that HR had interpretive leeway, you don't, I said. Calm, crisp, like flipping a switch labeled reality check. I opened to the final third of the document, page 17. Held it up. This section here, clause 16a, subsection Roman 3, it states, and I quote, any complaint brought against a designated author or interpreter of the policy must be independently reviewed for procedural bias. All internal adjudication is suspended pending external compliance oversight. I let it hang there. You filed a complaint against me, I continued. While using a document I authored, enforced, and ratified, you opened a disciplinary channel without triggering this clause. That is a procedural violation. Brent started to speak. Legal cut him off with a hand. The external compliance officer leaned forward. Do you have a timestamped version of the original clause? I handed her the memo. She read silently for 10 seconds, nodded, confirmed, this language is enforceable. Diane looked like she'd swallowed a thumbtack. We didn't mean to, that's the problem, I said. You didn't read it. You weaponized a process you didn't understand. The room went quiet. Legal scribbled something. The external officer pulled out her own copy of the HR procedural tree and drew a thick black X through the disciplinary track they'd been following. This entire process, she said flatly, is now subject to compliance review, not HR, effective immediately. That's when it hit them. This wasn't just about me. They'd invalidated the very structure they used to police everyone else. Every write-up, every warning, every fluffy little coaching plan with clip art and pastel fonts void. Because if they ignored my clause, who's to say they hadn't ignored others? They hadn't just violated policy. They'd gutted the foundation their own authority stood on. And now someone else, me, was holding the map. Brent finally spoke. What does this mean exactly? The compliance officer answered. It means Miss Keller isn't under investigation anymore. Then she turned to me. Do you like to file a formal response? I didn't smile. Not yet, I said. Let's finish the review first, line by line, because this wasn't the moment for revenge. It was the moment for receipts, and I had more, a lot more. Filed, time-stamped, cross-referenced, and ready. The tables hadn't just turned. I built the table. And now, finally, they realized who was sitting at the head of it. The room was full, not crowded, full. Like a theater where everyone knows the third act is going to hurt. Legal, HR, external compliance. A board observer dialing in from the coast, his voice already pinched from 2 time zones too many. And at last, Tanner himself, sweaty, late, and trying to laugh like he still had control of the temperature. He didn't. I stood at one end of the table. They had offered me a chair. I didn't take it. I wanted to speak from my feet, from the posture they'd spent weeks trying to bend. Council opened the meeting. Neutral tone. Legalese laced with caffeine and consequence. Today's objective is to complete the policy clarification review, he said, specifically the enforcement and authorship chain related to the conduct escalation memo and company handbook. Brent had the look of a man hoping for mercy from a spreadsheet. Diane sat silent, a legal pad in front of her, the pen untouched. Tanner kept checking his Apple Watch like a teenage boy waiting for gym class to be canceled. Counsel slid the handbook across the table. Miss Keller, would you please walk us through the relevant conclusion? I didn't need to, but I did, because some things need to be read out loud. I flipped to the final page of the printed handbook, held it in one hand. Read slowly, Final Interpretive Authority, B. Keller, Chief Compliance Architect. I paused, then turned to Tanner. I accept the findings of the external compliance review, I said. My voice was steady, cold, clear, and I am formally triggering a conduct investigation into the events and behaviors described in the original complaint. Per Clause 17, this review will include all related retaliation attempts, procedural violations, and misuse of internal policy by parties with supervisory access. Tanner blinked. His mouth twitched like he wanted to speak, but no words arrived. Across the table, Diane opened her mouth. I turned my gaze to her. Counsel raised a hand before she could exhale. Before you speak, he said, read the last page. She froze. It landed hard. Clause 17 wasn't just procedural. It wasn't just escalation. It was binding, triggered by author authority. And now it was live. That meant everything HR had done, from the tone policing to the memo co-opting, was not just ethically void. It was under formal legal review. Tanner slumped back into his chair. The color had drained from his face. He looked like a boy who just realized the haunted house was actually haunted. Across the table, legal was already whispering. Notes were being scribbled. The board liaison on Zoom muttered something about review implications and increased liability exposure. I closed the handbook, didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just said, that concludes my portion. And I walked out, no exit speech, no performance, just a quiet door swing and the soft clack of heels on corporate carpet. Behind me, the room erupted, papers shuffling, voices rising, emails flying before I even hit the elevator. But I didn't need to hear it, because I'd already written the last page. And now, finally, they were forced to read it. Tanner pale, HR scrambling, me, tone unchanged, authority absolute. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.